Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The Florida Keys are a string of sun-warmed islands trailing off the southern tip of Florida like loose beads from a broken necklace. They are places where the air carries the sharp salt of the Atlantic, where fishing boats bob lazily in the pre-dawn dark, and where residents often boast that life moves slower and softer than anywhere else on Earth. Big Coppic Key is one such island, quiet, unpretentious, and tucked just a few miles north of Key West. Its streets wind past modest stilt homes built high off the ground to weather hurricane floods, homes surrounded by the hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. It is the kind of community where everyone knows everyone, where work ends at the water's edge, and where an evening spent drinking with friends on the patio feels like the most natural thing in the world. It was in one of those stilt homes, on a warm June night in 2023, that Tyler Kinnan Nullish spent the last hours of his life. Tyler was 30 years old, young, full of the particular energy that comes from being at the stage of life where love feels like an answer to everything. He had been dating Brittany Nicole Holbrook for about 9 months, long enough to have moved into a shared home together at 491 Avenue F, Big Coppic Key, along with their roommate, a man named Jordan Kinn. The three of them had settled into a rhythm of cohabitation. Shared meals, shared evenings, the easy familiarity of people who live under the same roof and have learned to move around each other without friction. Brittany, 3 years older than Tyler at 33, worked as a manager in Key West. By all outward appearances, the couple's 9-month relationship had the shape of something real, something building toward a future. The evening of June 16, 2023, began the way countless evenings in that house had before it. After work, Tyler, Brittany, and Jordan gathered on the patio beneath the stilted house, the shaded, breezy underside of the structure where the heat of the day dissolved into the cooler night air. They drank together, talking and unwinding the way people do at the end of a long day, the sea breeze threading through the evening as the sun went down. There was nothing in those early hours to suggest that anything was wrong. There was laughter, perhaps. There was cold beer and easy conversation. Eventually, as the night deepened, all three went to bed. Jordan retreated to his bedroom. Tyler and Brittany returned to the room they shared. What happened in the hours that followed would be pieced together slowly, fragment by agonizing fragment, through a 911 call, police body camera footage, forensic evidence, and the dying words of Tyler Nullish himself. It was just before 3 in the morning when Jordan Kinn's eyes snapped open in the dark. He had been pulled from sleep not by a gentle sound, but by something visceral and alarming, the sound of Brittany screaming from the living room. Jordan was not a man who panicked easily. He climbed out of bed and walked toward the sound, pushing open the door to the living room, and what he found there stopped him cold. Tyler was lying on the floor, motionless except for the shallow, labored rise and fall of his chest. Blood, a terrible, spreading pool of it, soaked the floor beneath him. Brittany was beside him, holding him, screaming. The room had the chaotic, disoriented quality of a nightmare. Jordan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He crossed the room and knelt beside Tyler, placing a hand on his roommate, speaking to him. Tyler was drifting in and out of consciousness, his body weakened by blood loss, his eyes struggling to focus. Jordan asked him what had happened. Tyler gathered himself with what little strength remained in him. He looked up at his roommate and spoke the words that would become the spine of an entire criminal case, the words that would follow Brittany Holbrook for the rest of her life. "She shot me in the back," Tyler said. It was a dying declaration, words spoken by a man who understood, on some primal level, that he might not survive the next hour. Brittany, standing right there, heard every word. According to Jordan, she had no reaction. She did not deny it. She did not recoil. She did not say a single word in response to the accusation her boyfriend had just made against her in what might have been his final breath. Jordan grabbed his phone and called 911. His voice on the recording was strained with panic as he told the operator that his roommate was in bad shape, that he's hurt real bad, and that there was a lot of blood. Monroe County Sheriff's Office deputies were at the scene within 5 minutes, followed immediately by paramedics from Monroe County Fire Rescue. They arrived to find Tyler on the living room floor. Brittany crouched beside him, the air inside the house heavy with the metallic smell of blood. The paramedics worked quickly, assessing the wound, a gunshot to the lower left back. They loaded Tyler onto a stretcher, still breathing but unconscious, and rushed him to Lower Keys Medical Center, the nearest hospital capable of handling a trauma of this severity. The deputies swept the room. Their eyes moved methodically across the scene, cataloging evidence. Near a dog kennel on the floor, they found a 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun, and beside it, a single spent shell casing. The gun was not hidden. It was not disposed of. It lay there in the open, as if dropped in a moment of shock or indifference, or both. Jordan Kinn, when asked about the firearms in the home, told police that he was aware of 2 handguns in the house, one of which belonged to Brittany Holbrook. Brittany was brought in for questioning while Tyler fought for his life at the hospital. In those initial hours, the detectives who sat across from Brittany Holbrook encountered a woman who seemed at turns distraught and strangely measured. She told them first that she could not account for what had happened, that there was a gap in her memory. She said she remembered drinking on the patio, remembered going to bed, and then the next thing she knew, she was in the living room holding Tyler, who was covered in blood. She said she didn't know how she had gotten there. She said she had been screaming, which had woken Jordan up. She claimed that Tyler had made no statements while he was on the floor. The detectives listened. They took notes. They knew already that her account contradicted something important. Jordan Kinn had told them very clearly what Tyler had said. And so the questioning continued, gentle but probing, the way experienced detectives learned to press a story at its weakest seams. In a subsequent interview, Brittany's memory began, conveniently, to fill in. She told investigators that she had remembered more. She described Tyler getting out of their shared bed and going to the bathroom. When he returned, she said, he had been like a different person. She claimed he had attacked her, that he had pushed her against the wall and wrapped his hands around her throat, squeezing hard enough to cut off her breathing. She said she had punched and scratched him in an effort to get free. She told the detectives that she believed Tyler had been trying to kill her. And then she said her memory went blank again. She could not explain how she had escaped. She could not explain how Tyler had ended up on the floor with a bullet in his back. She told the detectives, with a calm that must have struck them as remarkable given the circumstances, that she had not fired a gun since moving to Big Coppitt Key from Stuart, Florida, over 9 months earlier. It was a story built on selective memory and emotional appeal. But the forensic evidence was indifferent to the narrative Brittany was constructing. The detectives examined her carefully. Brittany's knuckles, specifically on her right hand, showed bruising across several of them, consistent with someone who had thrown punches. That detail was noted. But then came the part that unraveled her story most decisively. If Tyler Nullish had truly wrapped his hands around her throat and squeezed with enough force to restrict her breathing, there would be physical evidence. Strangulation, even partial or interrupted, leaves marks, redness, bruising, the faint tracery of finger pressure on the skin. More specifically, forensic medicine has long recognized a phenomenon called petechiae, tiny, pinpoint hemorrhages that appear in the whites of the eyes and above the point of compression when the jugular veins are obstructed. They are among the most reliable indicators of strangulation. The detectives looked at Brittany's throat. There were no marks of any kind. They looked at her eyes. There were no petechiae. Her claim of strangulation, which formed the entire foundation of her self-defense argument, had no physical evidence to support it. Investigators continued to build their case. A friend of Tyler's came forward with a piece of information that sent a chill through the investigation, a detail that reframed the entire narrative in a way that was deeply unsettling. According to this friend, just 2 days before Tyler was shot, Brittany had spoken about having fantasies of violence toward her former boyfriend, a graphic, disturbing fantasy about cutting him open. This was not a throwaway remark. It was, the prosecution would later argue, a window into a state of mind, the kind of violent ideation that, in hindsight, felt like a forewarning that no one had recognized in time. At 3:46 in the morning on June 17, 2023, Tyler Kinnan Nullish was pronounced dead at Lower Keys Medical Center. He was 30 years old. He had come to Big Coppic Key to build a life, to share a home with someone he cared about, to wake up each morning to the sound of the Florida Keys and the particular, irreplaceable freedom of living close to the water. He did not get to do any of that anymore. Brittany Holbrook was arrested and charged with 1 count of murder. She was transported to the Monroe County Detention Center, where she was held on a bond of $500,000. The arrest affidavit, signed by the detective who had led the investigation, laid out the reasoning plainly. Based on Jordan Kinn's account, the dying declaration Tyler had made, the inconsistencies riddling Brittany's story, and the complete absence of physical injuries consistent with her strangulation claim, there was probable cause to believe she had killed him. The case moved through the legal system with the slow deliberation that the gravity of a murder charge demands. Months became a year, and then nearly 2 years as attorneys prepared, evidence was analyzed, and the mechanics of justice ground forward. Brittany maintained, throughout this period, that she had acted in self-defense. Her legal team would argue that the events of that night were not a premeditated act of violence, but a desperate response to a man she believed was trying to kill her. The defense leaned heavily on the memory gaps, the idea that Brittany had been so traumatized, so overwhelmed by adrenaline and fear, that she genuinely could not reconstruct what had happened. But there are some things that evidence does not forget, even when human memory claims to. The trial unfolded in early 2025 before a Monroe County jury. Prosecutor's Chief Assistant State Attorney Joseph Mansfield and Assistant State Attorney David Alvarez methodically laid out the state's case, building it piece by piece. They presented Jordan Kinn, who described waking to Brittany's screaming, finding Tyler on the floor, and hearing those words Tyler had spent his final energies on, accusing the person in the room. They introduced the forensic findings, the gunshot wound to the lower left back, which told its own story about direction, about proximity, about the mechanics of what had actually happened in that living room in the dark. They noted the absence of strangulation injuries on Brittany, and the 9mm handgun lying on the floor near the dog kennel, with its single spent casing. And they placed before the jury the account of Tyler's friend, the disturbing detail of violent fantasies expressed by Brittany just 48 hours before Tyler died. The defense attempted to humanize Brittany, to present her as a frightened woman who had acted out of desperation in a moment of terror. But the physical evidence kept pointing in a single direction. A bullet wound to the back is not the wound of a man who was advancing on someone. It is the wound of a man who was moving away, or who never had the chance to turn around at all. The jury deliberated for less than 1 hour. On February 24, 2025, Brittany Nicole Holbrook was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Tyler Kinnan Nullish. The speed of the verdict, the compressed, decisive hour of deliberation, said something about the weight of the evidence. The jury had heard everything. They had considered the dying words, the missing marks, the recovered gun, the violent fantasy. They had sat with the facts, and the facts had pointed clearly to one conclusion. On April 11, 2025, Brittany Holbrook stood before a Monroe County judge and received her sentence, 40 years in state prison. The first 25 years are to be served without the possibility of earned gain time, meaning no early release for good behavior during that period. She was 35 years old when the sentence was handed down. If she lives to see the end of her full term, she will emerge as an elderly woman. State Attorney Dennis Ward, in a statement released after the sentencing, chose words that carried the weight of everything the case had revealed. "This case," he said, "is a tragic reminder of how quickly domestic arguments can turn deadly." It was a careful phrasing, not accusatory in its tone, but honest about the territory the case had explored. The erosion between two people who lived together, the drinking, the argument in the dark, the moment when something ordinary becomes something fatal and irreversible. Chief Assistant State Attorney Joseph Mansfield was more direct. "The evidence spoke volumes," he said. Mr. Nullish's final words, combined with the forensic findings and lack of physical injuries consistent with Holbrook's self-defense claim, made the facts clear. Tyler's final words. That phrase lodged itself at the center of the case from the very beginning and remained there through the verdict and beyond. In the literature of criminal law, a dying declaration carries a particular legal weight, the understanding that a person who believes they are dying has no incentive to lie. Tyler Nullish, bleeding on the floor of his own living room in the early hours of the morning, used some of his last conscious breaths to name the person who had done this to him. It was the last coherent thing he communicated to the world, and in the end, it was enough. Tyler Nullish was 30 years old. He had moved to the Florida Keys, to a stilt house on a quiet street on Big Coppic Key, to share his life with someone he had chosen. He had spent the last evening of his life the way so many evenings in those islands are spent, outside in the warm dark, with a drink in hand, with friends nearby, with the salt air on his skin, and no reason at all to believe that the night was anything other than what it appeared to be. He was not a headline. He was not a case number. He was a young man who deserved, as all young men do, to grow older. The Florida Keys continued to glitter in the sun. The fishing boats still bob in the pre-dawn water. The stilt houses along Avenue F still stand, elevated above the flood line, braced against the storms that come and go. And somewhere in the middle of that beauty, in a home that once held 3 ordinary people living ordinary lives, a chapter of something was written that cannot be unwritten. A story that ended with a single gunshot, a pool of blood on a living room floor, and the last words of a man who refused to go silently into the dark. Story 2. Bogota is a city that never fully sleeps. Even in its quieter residential zones, where apartment towers rise above tree-lined streets and the noise of traffic retreats to a background hum in the early hours before dawn, there is always a light on somewhere, always a sound carrying through the cool mountain air of the savannah. The Colombian capital sits more than 2,600 meters above sea level, and its altitude gives the nights a particular chill, a sharpness that settles into the skin during the dark hours and lifts only slowly when the sun returns over the eastern Andes. It is a city of millions, of ambition and creativity, and the particular energy of young professionals building their lives in a country that has known too much violence and learned, perhaps more than most, to value the ordinary gifts of safety and the future. In the early hours of July 27, 2025, that night air over the Barrios Unidos neighborhood in the western part of the city carried something that did not belong to an ordinary Sunday morning. At the residential complex known as Salader Living, on a quiet street in the localidad where families had built their lives in mid-rise apartment buildings with views of the Cordillera on clear days, something had gone terribly wrong on the 9th floor. Laura Camila Blanco Osorio was 26 years old. She was a journalist, a comunicadora social, in the Colombian professional designation, trained in the discipline of observing and reporting on the world with precision and clarity. She had the qualities that good journalists carry: curiosity, attention to detail, the capacity to listen and to ask questions, and to pursue the truth of a thing past the surface level at which most conversations stop. She was Bogotana by formation and identity, a young woman whose career was in its early, promising years, whose friends described her as warm and alive in the way that some people are, the kind of person whose presence raises the energy of a room, and whose absence leaves a specific, irreplaceable gap. She lived alone in her apartment on the 9th floor of Salader Living, which was both a sign of her independence and, in the reconstruction of what happened that night, one of the facts that would matter enormously. For Laura, the evening of July 26, 2025 had begun as a celebration. Laura's boyfriend, Oscar Santiago Gomez Leal, was a 29-year-old systems engineer, and the occasion was his graduation. He had completed a degree, a milestone worth marking, and the couple had gathered friends to share the moment. The celebration moved to Laura's apartment in Barrios Unidos, her space, her home, the place where she was most herself. Friends filled the apartment with the noise and ease of young people celebrating in the way they do. Music, conversation, the ordinary warmth of a group of people who know each other well, and have arrived at that pleasant stage of an evening when nothing is required of anyone except to be present and glad. Laura and Oscar had been together for 2 years. The relationship, from the outside, carried the surface appearance of a young couple navigating the complexities of modern life. Two professionals in Bogota, building their careers, spending time in the circles of shared friends, making their way together. But something had been growing inside the relationship between Laura Camila Blanco and Oscar Santiago Gomez Leal that her family had seen and feared and named. They had watched it with the helpless apprehension of people who love someone in a relationship they cannot control, who offer warnings and support and hope that the warning will be enough to change the trajectory. What the family had observed was described as a pattern of gender-based violence that marked the 2 years of the relationship. Gomez had called Laura demeaning names, humiliating her over her appearance, her behavior as a woman, her decisions. He had been jealous in a way that crossed from affection into control, reviewing her phone, monitoring her movements, policing her social life with the particular intensity of someone who does not love freely but possesses. Each of these behaviors, standing alone, might be minimized or explained away. Together, across 2 years, they formed what prosecutors would later call a pattern. The architecture of a relationship in which one person's dignity was being systematically dismantled by the other. The celebration on the night of July 26th continued until the hours crossed into July 27th. At some point during the evening, Laura and Oscar withdrew from the gathering and moved into the main bedroom of the apartment. The friends remained in the other rooms, heard what they heard, and saw what their position allowed them to see. A discussion, a confrontation, the quality of sound that distinguishes an argument from a conversation, even through a closed door. Then, in the early morning hours of July 27, 2025, something fell from the 9th floor of Salader Living. The neighbors and residents who were still awake, or who were woken by the sound, called emergency services. The Bogota Emergency Response System dispatched first responders to the complex. What they found in the area below the 9th floor was Laura Camila Blanco, her body on the ground outside the building, beneath the window of her own apartment. She was transported urgently to a hospital. She died from her injuries. In the immediate aftermath, Oscar Santiago Gomez Leal told the story that would define the first phase of the case. Laura had jumped, he said. She had taken her own life. It had been a terrible night, a terrible loss, and she had gone to the window herself and leaped. It was the version of events that, if accepted, would close the case as a tragic suicide. A young woman at a party, something breaking inside her, an irreversible decision made in the dark. It was the version that, if true, would mean that no crime had occurred, that no one had done anything to Laura Camila Blanco except herself. Laura's family did not accept it for a moment. They had known their daughter, their sister, their Laura, had known her personality, her state of mind, her relationship, the things she had told them, and the things they had observed directly. A person does not need to be in perfect mental health for their family to know with certainty that this was not who they were, not what they were capable of choosing, not consistent with anything they knew about the woman they had watched grow up and build her life. And the family had also known about Oscar Gomez. They had known about the episodes of control and humiliation. They had seen the relationship from the outside with the particular clarity that sometimes only proximity and love together provide. From the first hours after Laura's death, they rejected the suicide narrative and began demanding that the authorities treat the case as something more. They demanded an investigation. They demanded that forensic evidence be collected and examined. They demanded that the circumstances of their daughter's death be subjected to scrutiny before any conclusion was reached. And so the investigators worked. The Instituto Nacional de Medicina Legal, Colombia's National Forensic Science Institute, the authority responsible for conducting autopsies and producing the technical evidence upon which criminal investigations depend, performed the examination of Laura Camila Blanco's body with the thoroughness that a case of this nature required. The process took time. Forensic conclusions of the kind being sought cannot be rushed without compromising their reliability, and the forensic team understood that their findings would carry the full weight of a possible murder investigation. They worked carefully. They documented everything. They analyzed. 2 months after Laura's death, the Instituto de Medicina Legal delivered its conclusions. The report was the forensic turning point of the entire case. The document that the Fiscalia would later describe as the Prueba Reina, the Queen of Evidence, the single most important piece of technical proof in the proceedings against Oscar Gomez. What it found was unambiguous. Laura Camila Blanco had not jumped. She had not chosen to go through that window. The pathological examination of her body revealed two categories of findings that together eliminated the suicide hypothesis entirely. First, she had suffered asphyxia mixta, mixed asphyxiation, before the fall. Her airways had been mechanically blocked, consistent with strangulation or suffocation. She had been deprived of air while she was still inside the apartment before her body left the 9th floor. Second, the examination found signs of defensive struggle, the particular patterns of injury that a human body acquires when it attempts to resist an attack. Bruises and marks in the specific distributions that forensic pathologists recognize as the body's instinctive effort to protect itself from harm. The report concluded that the manner of death was violent, oriented to homicide. Not a fall, not a choice. Violence. The Fiscalia moved quickly once the forensic report was in hand. Investigators pieced together what had happened. Oscar Gomez had used his physical superiority over Laura. He was larger and stronger, to strangle and suffocate her inside the bedroom of her apartment. He had pressed against her neck, cutting off her air, while she fought to resist him. The struggle was documented in the forensic evidence, in the marks that her body bore, in the bruising consistent with her attempts to push him away or break free. When she was no longer able to resist, when she had been reduced to a state of agony and indefension, defenselessness, the terrible word prosecutors would use, he had carried her to the window of the 9th floor and thrown her through it and into the Bogota night. The window, the 9th floor, the pavement below, the emergency call, the man who then stood before investigators and said she had jumped. The friends in the other rooms who had heard an argument through a door and who were now, without having understood what they were hearing, witnesses to the reconstruction of a femicide. On August 21st, 2025, less than a month after the Medicina legal report and 25 days after Laura's death, the Fiscalia ordered the arrest of Oscar Santiago Gomez Leal. The operation to apprehend him was coordinated by the Criminal Investigation Unit and carried out in Bogota. He was taken into custody and transported to a hearing that was conducted virtually, as Colombian judicial procedure permits in urgent matters. Fiscal Juan Camilo Caicedo stood before the digital proceedings and addressed Gomez directly in terms that cut through any remaining ambiguity about what the state believed had happened. In multiple occasions you called the victim a prostitute, the fiscal said. You reprimanded her for her behavior as a woman. You called her fat. You were jealous of her. You checked her phone. Each accusation was a documented fact, reconstructed from testimony and evidence. Together they were the indictment not just of an act on a single night, but of 2 years of a relationship conducted under the shadow of systematic dehumanization. A relationship in which Gomez had spent 2 years reducing Laura Camila Blanco in her own eyes and in the eyes of their shared world, building toward a night in which he exercised the final and most absolute form of control available to an abuser. Oscar Gomez, seated with his defense attorney Juan Jairo Rosas, listened to the charges of aggravated femicide, the Colombian legal classification for the killing of a woman by reason of her gender, one of the most seriously charged offenses in the country's penal code, and rejected them. He did not accept the charges. He maintained his version: Laura had jumped. He had not harmed her. The death was a suicide. The judge ordered him held in preventive detention. The defense attorney argued against the measure, claiming that the evidence did not justify imprisonment. The judge was unconvinced. Gomez was sent to a Bogota correctional facility, where he remained throughout the months that followed as the investigation continued to build its case. Laura's family had been present at every hearing since the beginning. They came to each proceeding, the legal arguments over detention, the procedural steps of a Colombian criminal process that, like all such processes, moves in stages that can feel agonizingly slow to people waiting for justice for someone they loved. They sat in those courtrooms and hearing rooms and followed each development with the fierce, exhausted attention of people who have committed themselves fully to a single purpose. They had been the ones who refused to accept the suicide narrative from the beginning. They had been the ones who named Gomez and named the violence and demanded that the authorities look more closely. Without that insistence, Without the family's absolute refusal to let the case close as a suicide, it is possible that no forensic investigation would have gone deep enough to find what Medicina Legal ultimately found. The months between August 2025 and February 2026 were the months of building. The Fiscalia's investigation team worked through the evidence, the forensic report, the witness testimonies of the friends who had been in the apartment, the digital evidence from phones and communications, the prior documented incidents of violence within the relationship, the reconstruction of the timeline of that night from arrival at the apartment through the celebration, through the argument, through the early morning hours when everything ended. The investigators also examined claims from the defense and worked to establish whether any of Gomez's alternative explanations could be reconciled with the physical evidence. They could not. On February 25, 2026, the Fiscalia General de la Nación formally presented its written charge document that officially initiates the oral trial phase in the Colombian accusatorial justice system. The document was comprehensive. It described in legal and factual terms what prosecutors argued had occurred: a 2-year relationship characterized by gender-based violence, a graduation celebration that turned into a confrontation in a bedroom, a man who used his physical advantage to strangle a woman who fought to survive, a woman rendered defenseless who was then thrown from the 9th floor of her own home, a perpetrator who then attempted to present her death to authorities as a voluntary act. The charge was aggravated femicide. The aggravating circumstances included the prior history of violence within the relationship, the particularly brutal nature of the act, and the deliberate attempt to mislead investigators about what had occurred. Under Colombian law, the offense carries a potential sentence of more than 40 years in prison. Oscar Santiago Gomez Leal continued to deny the charges. His defense had maintained, across every phase of the proceedings, that Laura had not died from asphyxiation but rather in transit to the hospital, and that her death was consistent with suicide. The defense contested the forensic methodology, contested the interpretation of the evidence, and contested the legal application of the femicide classification. Every legal process of this nature contains two narratives competing for the court's credence, and in this case the competing narratives were as stark and irreconcilable as they could be. On one side, a woman who died fighting for her life; on the other, a woman who chose to die. The oral trial phase, having been formally initiated in February 2026, was pending before the Bogota courts as of the early months of that year. The proceedings had not yet reached a verdict. Gomez remained in preventive detention. The trial, with its witness testimony, its confrontation of forensic experts, its arguments about the science of asphyxiation, and the interpretation of bruising and the legal standard for femicide, was still ahead. But the forensic truth, in the estimation of Colombia's National Institute for Legal Medicine, was already established. Laura Camila Blanco had not jumped. She had fought. The evidence of her resistance, the marks on her body that the examiners catalogued and classified and named, spoke to a young woman who had not surrendered, who had understood, in the terrible clarity of those final moments in her own bedroom, that something irreversible was happening, and who had pushed back against it with every physical resource available to her. The friends who had been in the other rooms heard an argument through a closed door. They did not know what they were hearing. They could not have known that on the other side of that door, Laura Camila Blanco was fighting to stay alive in her own apartment, surrounded by the ordinary objects of her daily life, her furniture, her things, the space she had made hers, while the man she had been with for 2 years used his physical advantage to end it. By the time anyone opened that door, it was too late. The case of Laura Camila Blanco joined a public conversation that had been ongoing for years, about the patterns that precede femicide, about the failure of systems to intervene early enough, about the gap between the warning signs that families observe and the point at which institutions act. Her family had seen the signs. They had worried. They had watched the relationship with apprehension. None of that had been sufficient to prevent what happened on the 9th floor of Salader, living in the early hours of July 27th. Laura had not wanted to die. She had wanted to live. She had spent 2 years in a relationship that eroded her dignity, and she had died fighting to preserve her life. The forensic evidence confirmed what her family had known from the beginning, that the woman they loved had been taken from them, not lost. Laura Camila Blanco was 26 years old. She was a journalist, a professional whose entire training was oriented toward discovering and telling the truth. There is an unbearable irony in the fact that the truth of her own death had to be fought for the way it was, that the initial narrative presented by the man who killed her nearly became the official version, that it was only the insistence of her family and the precision of forensic science that turned the case from a closed file into a criminal prosecution. In the apartment on the 9th floor of Salader, living in Barrios Unidos, the window through which she fell is still a window in a wall of a building on a street in Bogota. The city moves around it the way cities move around everything, indifferently, continuously, without pause. But in the rooms of a family who refused to stop demanding the truth, and in the offices of prosecutors building a case toward a courtroom, the window is evidence. The night of July 27th is a timeline. The forensic report is a document. And Laura Camila Blanco, who loved journalism and lived in a 9th-floor apartment in the capital of her country and fought, in her final moments, to stay alive, is a woman whose truth is still being told. Story 3. There is silence that settles over a small American town in the hours just before dawn. The silence of people asleep in their beds, trusting the darkness to be safe. In Tip City, Ohio, a quiet community nestled in Miami County where neighbors still wave to each other across driveways and children ride bicycles without helmets along tree-lined streets, that silence felt like a permanent gift. It was the silence of a town that believed it was protected from the worst of the world. That silence broke forever on the morning of February 16, 2026. Ashley Elizabeth Flynn was 37 years old, a graduate of Tip City High School, where she had walked those same hallways that her students would one day walk. She went on to earn her degree from Lee University in 2010, returning to her hometown not as someone who had outgrown it, but as someone who chose it deliberately with love. She became a teacher first at Tip City schools and then, more recently, as a dedicated educator with LifeWise Academy, a nonprofit that brought Hollywood-based education to young students. She also volunteered passionately at the Christian Life Center, her church, a place where she found community and purpose. But perhaps the role that best captured Ashley's spirit was that of volleyball coach. She coached 7th grade girls at Tippecanoe Middle School, a group of young people at the most uncertain, searching age of their lives. She was not just a coach to them. She was someone who saw them. She was known for her beautiful smile, warmth, kindness, and the positive impact she had on so many, both in and out of the classroom. These are not the words people use about someone who merely did their job. These are the words used for someone who genuinely made a difference. At home, Ashley was a devoted mother to 2 young daughters and a wife. She and her husband, Caleb, appeared to the outside world as the kind of couple that gave other couples hope, attractive, faith-filled, deeply rooted in their community. Their life together in Tip City seemed, to those who saw it from the outside, like something close to ideal. Caleb Flynn had always believed in the power of story. He was originally from Braham, Minnesota, the son of Pastor Mike Flynn and Kim Flynn of the Open Arms Church of God, a family for whom faith was not just a Sunday practice, but the very air they breathed. Caleb had grown up tall, athletic, a state championship basketball player in high school before music consumed him entirely. By the time he was a young man, he had relocated to Tip City, Ohio, where he became a music pastor and worship leader at the Christian Life Center. He had a voice that people remembered, warm, resonant, the kind of voice that could fill a church hall and make the person in the back row feel spoken to directly. In 2013, not long after he and Ashley had married, he took that voice to one of the most watched stages in America. He auditioned for season 12 of American Idol in Chicago and was awarded a coveted golden ticket to Hollywood. During a behind-the-scenes interview, he told producers that music was all I know. It's what I live to do and I love. He spoke of his wife. He spoke of his faith. He was charming, genuine, easy to root for. He did not win American Idol, but he returned home to Tip City with something perhaps more valuable to him at the time: a reputation as a good man, a talented man, a man of God with a family he adored. The years that followed saw him continue his work as a worship leader and music pastor, both in Ohio and at churches in South Carolina. His congregation trusted him. His community admired him. And behind all of that, behind the voice, behind the faith, behind the carefully curated image of a loving husband and father, something was quietly, irreversibly wrong. It came in at approximately 2:30 in the morning on Monday, February 16, 2026. A frantic call to emergency services from a home on the residential streets of Tip City. The voice on the line was Caleb Flynn's. He was breathless, desperate, or appeared to be. He reported that his wife had been shot. He said there had been a break-in, that an intruder had entered their home and attacked Ashley. He told the dispatcher that the garage door was open, that he had not seen anyone else in the house. He was wailing, he was sobbing, he was, to listen to the call, a man utterly destroyed by what he had just encountered. Their 2 young daughters were asleep upstairs, he said. They had not been harmed. The first officers to arrive at the Flynn residence found Ashley lying in the bedroom, shot in the head. 2 shell casings had come to rest on the floor nearby. Ashley Flynn was dead. The scene around her told a story. There were indications of forced entry, signs that someone had attempted to create the impression of a break-in. Caleb, speaking to officers who had just responded to the scene, pointed to the garage as the likely point of entry. He mentioned his 9mm handgun, telling them he stored it in the empty console of his truck, which was parked in the garage. The console was open when officers looked. It should have been a straightforward tragedy. A home invaded, a woman killed, a family shattered by random violence. That is what the scene appeared to be saying. But experienced investigators are trained to listen to what a scene is saying, and then ask themselves, why is it speaking so clearly? In criminal investigations, it is often the smallest, most mundane detail that unravels the largest deception. In this case, it was not a fingerprint or a blood splatter pattern or a surveillance camera. It was a refrigerator. When officers examined the side door of the garage, the door that Caleb's story implicitly suggested an intruder had used to enter, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. Positioned directly against that door, on the interior side, was a large refrigerator, not pushed slightly, not loosely positioned, firmly, fully blocking the doorway. For an intruder to have entered through that door, the refrigerator would have had to be pushed away first, from inside. And for it to have been blocking the door again after an intruder entered, someone on the inside would have had to push it back. There was no intruder who had done this. The refrigerator had not moved itself. The logic of Caleb's story, an intruder entering through that door, was, in the words later used by investigators, physically impossible. For the detectives now walking slowly, carefully through every room of that house, the picture was shifting. The 911 call, reviewed again with fresh eyes, raised its own questions. The dispatcher had asked Caleb multiple times whether he had checked on his daughters, and his answers had been hesitant, oddly delayed. For a father in a house where an intruder might still be present, where his children were sleeping just above him, the urgency about the children seemed somehow muted. These were small things. Individually, each one could be explained away. Together, they began to form a shape. The crime scene, investigators would later state in court documents, had been deliberately staged, manipulated to create the false impression of a home invasion, to lead officers astray, to redirect suspicion away from the person who actually lived in that house. Caleb Flynn had called 911 as if he were a witness. Investigators were beginning to believe he was the perpetrator. For 3 days, Tip City mourned Ashley Flynn with a grief that was both communal and deeply personal. The Tip City schools released a statement. Her church held a private memorial. A public celebration of life had to be canceled because of the intense media attention that was now descending on the small town. Students who had played volleyball under her guidance tried to find words. Former colleagues shared photographs. People who had never met her personally, but had passed her in the school hallway, felt the particular ache of a community that has lost someone irreplaceable. Her obituary described her as a devoted and loving wife, and a caring and dedicated mother to her 2 daughters. Those words, written in grief before the full truth had yet emerged, carried an especially devastating weight in the days that followed. On Thursday evening, February 19, 2026, just 3 days after Ashley's death, Tip City police arrived at the Flynn residence and arrested Caleb Flynn. He was taken into custody and booked into the Miami County Jail. Charges were filed against him: murder, 2 counts of felonious assault with a deadly weapon, and 2 counts of tampering with evidence. The man who had wept into a phone at 2:30 in the morning, who had told dispatchers that his wife was bleeding, who had said an intruder was to blame, was now behind bars, accused of being that very thing himself. The community's grief did not disappear when Caleb was arrested. It transformed into something more complex, a grief threaded with disbelief, with anger, with a terrible need to understand. The following morning, February 20th, 2026, Caleb Flynn appeared in court via video arraignment from his jail cell. The screen showed a man who looked like someone still processing a catastrophe, but whether that was the catastrophe of guilt or the catastrophe of grief was impossible to determine from appearance alone. He entered a not guilty plea to all charges. When Judge Samuel Huffman asked if he had anything to say regarding the question of his bond, Caleb Flynn looked directly at the camera and said, "I just want to take care of my daughters. I'm not a risk." It was a statement that landed differently depending on who was hearing it. To those who believed him innocent, it was the plea of a grieving father separated from the only family he had left. To those who did not, it was something more unsettling. A man who had allegedly taken the mother of his daughters, now invoking those daughters as a reason for his own freedom. Judge Huffman set the bond at $2 million. Caleb remained in jail. While the legal machinery of Miami County ground forward, the people of Tip City did what small communities have always done when the unthinkable happens. They showed up for each other. Ashley Flynn had left behind 2 young daughters, girls who would grow up without a mother's voice at breakfast, without her presence at school plays and sports games, and the 1,000 invisible moments that add up to a childhood. The community determined that these girls would not grow up without knowing they were surrounded by love. Local businesses across Tip City and beyond organized fundraisers almost immediately. Kid Clubhouse, an indoor playground, dedicated a full Tuesday to Ashley's daughters. 351 children came to play, and 540 people purchased gift cards online from across the country, raising $37,455 in a single day. Red Devil Pizza and Deli raised more than $4,000 over a single weekend. Tony's Bada Bing donated a portion of sales, matched by Granite Transformations. A bookshop in Dayton, a pizza place, a playground, each one a small act of defiance against the darkness that had settled over the town. The veterans of foreign wars held a benefit at Fulton Farms Market. People came who had never met Ashley personally, who simply understood that a mother's absence leaves a wound that never fully closes, and that when a community stands together, the wound at least does not have to be faced alone. Ashley Flynn touched so many people's lives in this town, one resident told reporters. It was the most honest thing anyone could say. As the weeks passed, investigators continued to build their case. Bodycam footage from the night of the crime was eventually released by Ohio authorities. Chilling, unambiguous video that showed Caleb Flynn's behavior in the immediate aftermath of Ashley's death, before any arrest, before any charges. The footage captured him wailing, visibly distressed. It also showed him calling his mother to share the news of Ashley's death. But what precisely those calls revealed, and what the investigators made of them, remained part of the ongoing evidentiary picture that prosecutors were carefully assembling. The court documents painted a picture of a deliberately constructed deception, a staged crime scene designed to draw investigators' attention toward a fictional intruder. A gun that was supposed to belong to a burglar, but that had, according to authorities, been Caleb's own. 2 shell casings in the bedroom where his wife lay dead. A refrigerator placed against a door that no intruder could possibly have used. A 911 call that investigators believed was made not by a panicked witness, but by the person responsible. On March 18, 2026, a Miami County grand jury handed down an indictment on 11 counts. The charges now included 1 count of aggravated murder, the most serious possible charge, as well as 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, 3 counts of tampering with evidence, and 2 misdemeanor counts of intimidation of an attorney, victim, or witness in a criminal case. The intimidation charges added a new and deeply troubling dimension to the case, suggesting that the alleged deception had not ended with Ashley's death. Caleb Flynn pleaded not guilty to all 11 counts. His bond, which had previously been set at $2 million, was now raised to $3.5 million cash only. He remained in custody. He was ordered to have no contact with his daughters. Miami County Prosecutor Paul Watkins made the stakes explicit. If convicted of aggravated murder, Caleb Flynn would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of the final days of March 2026, Caleb Flynn sits in Miami County Jail awaiting a pretrial hearing scheduled for March 30th, the same date this story was being written. The legal process will take its time, as it must. He has pleaded not guilty, and under the law, every person accused is presumed innocent until guilt is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That is not a formality. It is a principle that holds the entire system together. But beyond the legal proceedings, beyond the courtroom and the charges and the arguments that attorneys will make before a judge, there is the irreducible human reality of what has happened. Ashley Flynn, the woman with the beautiful smile, the teacher who cared, the volleyball coach who saw her students, the mother of 2 little girls, the woman who volunteered at her church and walked through her life with warmth and faith, is gone. She was 37 years old. She had decades ahead of her. Her daughters were asleep in their beds when she died, and they will carry the weight of that night for the rest of their lives. A community that trusted its silence has learned that silence can be deceiving. The people of Tip City, Ohio, who raised nearly $40,000 in a single day for 2 little girls who no longer have their mother, have shown something more powerful than grief alone. They have shown that love, even in the face of the most devastating betrayal, refuses to be extinguished. Somewhere in those acts, in the pizza shops and the playgrounds and the VFW halls turned into fundraising spaces, Ashley Flynn is still present. Not as a victim, not as a case number, but as a woman who mattered, who is remembered, who touched so many lives that even now, even in her absence, the warmth she carried keeps spreading outward, finding its way to the 2 small girls she left behind. That warmth is her truest legacy. No courtroom can take it away. Story 4. The Gulf of Mexico does not change its mood for anyone. It moves at its own pace, indifferent to the human dramas playing out on its shores. The families building sandcastles, the couples walking the seawall at sunset, the tourists photographing the water from their hotel balconies as the Texas sun drops low and colors the sky in shades of copper and amber. Galveston, Texas, is one of those places that carries the weight of its history in the salt air. A barrier island city that has endured hurricanes and floods and losses that would have unmade other places, and kept going anyway. It is a city that knows what it means to survive. October 2024 arrived there with the gentleness of a Gulf Coast autumn, the heat easing just enough to make a walk along Seawall Boulevard feel like a gift rather than an endurance test. Along that seawall, at the intersection of the boulevard and 59th Street, the Beachfront Palms Hotel stood the way it always did. Ordinary, functional, the kind of place families stopped on their way through Galveston, a modest 3-story building with balconies facing outward toward the street, toward the city, toward the particular quality of light that belongs to coastal places and nowhere else. Guests came and went. The lobby moved in the rhythms of check-in and check-out. Children tracked sand through the corridors. The normalcy of it was complete and total. And then something fell from the 3rd floor. Hannah Yanko was 17 months old. She was at the age that children arrive at the world fully. Not as newborns still finding their dimensions, but as small, formed human beings with personalities and preferences, and the particular fierce joy of toddlers who have recently discovered movement, who are perpetually in the process of exploring the edges of the world available to them. She had dark eyes and the kind of energy that makes adults tired and grateful at the same time. She was the daughter of Channel Jasmine Yanko, a 30-year-old woman from Houston who had brought her to Galveston on that October day. The people who found Hannah on the pavement of 59th Street, on the narrow stretch of sidewalk between the Kroger grocery store and the hotel, arrived on the scene to something that belonged entirely outside the ordinary. The baby was alive when they reached her. She was bleeding, and she had suffered injuries consistent with a fall from height, but the most immediate and confusing detail, the detail that set this apart from the terrible accident it might otherwise have resembled, was the presence of puncture wounds on her tiny back. 3 of them, delivered to the body of a 17-month-old child in a hotel room, before she was carried to the balcony railing and dropped to the street below. Emergency services responded with the speed that such a call demands. Hannah was found still drawing breath, and the fact that she had survived the fall, however briefly, meant that the people who reached her were trying to save her life in the first terrible moments before the full picture had assembled itself. She was transported by EMS to the trauma center at UTMB Galveston, the University of Texas Medical Branch Hospital that serves the island and its surrounding region, equipped to handle the most severe of injuries. She was pronounced dead a short time after arrival. She had lived 17 months. The surveillance cameras at the Beachfront Palms Hotel, positioned to monitor the building's exterior as most hotel cameras are, had been recording throughout. When investigators reviewed that footage in the hours after Hannah's death, what they saw on the screen of a monitor in a Galveston police facility was footage that at least one official would later describe as among the most difficult they had ever been required to examine in a professional career. The camera angle captured the third-floor balcony with enough clarity to tell the story without ambiguity. A small form, 17 months old, for limbs the proportions of a toddler, descended from the balcony railing and fell to the street below. The footage did not show an accident. It showed a deliberate act. Channel Yonko was identified, located, and taken into custody. She was 30 years old, a Houston resident who had brought her daughter to this hotel on this particular day under circumstances that investigators would spend months working to understand. In the initial arrest affidavit and in the court documents that followed, a portrait emerged not of a spontaneous act committed in a single moment of terrible impulse, but of something more deliberate, something that had taken place inside the hotel room first, before the balcony, before the fall, before the pavement. The 3 puncture wounds on Hannah's back told the investigators that her mother had taken a sharp object and used it on a child too young to understand what was happening to her. Galveston police recovered what they described as a murder weapon. The hotel room itself contained what investigators called bloody evidence, photographs of which would later be presented to a jury in a Galveston County courtroom. The room was not the scene of a woman in the grip of a sudden, uncontrollable episode. It was a scene that told the story of an act conducted in stages, with the deliberate progression that investigators, prosecutors, and forensic experts would later argue was evidence of awareness, of intent. And then there was what Channel Yonko did in the 4 minutes after her daughter's body hit the pavement of 59th Street. She did not go to Hannah. She did not run down the stairs to find out if her child had survived. She did not collapse. She did not call emergency services. In the 4 minutes immediately following the moment Hannah fell from the balcony, Channel Yonko opened her phone and attempted to call an Uber. She wanted a car. She wanted to leave Galveston. She wanted to be somewhere else. Somewhere that was not a hotel room with blood on the walls, not a street where her daughter was lying on the pavement, not a city where the cameras had recorded everything. The Uber request did not succeed in removing her from the scene. Law enforcement arrived first. She was taken into custody in Galveston and transported to the county jail. Within days, she had been charged with capital murder, specifically with capital murder of a person under 10 years of age, which under Texas law carries a single sentencing option: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There is no discretion in the sentencing. The conviction produces the sentence automatically, by operation of the law. The grand jury indicted her on that charge in the weeks that followed. She was held, and the long machinery of a serious criminal prosecution began to move. In the approximately 17 months between Hannah's death and the beginning of Channel Yonko's trial, the case accumulated the kind of weight that certain criminal matters carry, not just from the evidence, but from the public's awareness of it. The story had spread across Texas and beyond in the days following Hannah's death. A hotel in Galveston, a toddler, a balcony, a mother. The details were not the kind that people quickly moved past. For parents especially, for anyone who had ever held a small child and felt the full human vulnerability of someone who is alive and trusting and entirely dependent on the person holding them, the details of this case settled somewhere deep and refused to leave. The trial began in March 2026 in Galveston County District Court. It lasted 1 week. The courthouse in Galveston, like the city itself, carries a certain historical gravity. It has seen more than a century of justice administered and contested within its walls. The courtroom where Channel Yanko sat and faced the charge against her was full of the particular tension that capital murder trials carry. The formality, the precision of procedure, the weight of what is being decided. Prosecutors described the case, in terms that would later be repeated widely in coverage, as one of the most difficult they had ever had to present. It was not difficult because the evidence was thin. It was difficult because of what the evidence was about, because the victim was 17 months old, and the photographs and footage and forensic testimony all required the jury to look, again and again, at the full reality of what had been done to her. The lead prosecutor built a case constructed from multiple forms of evidence, each reinforcing the others. The surveillance footage from the hotel exterior was presented, the footage that showed, with the impersonal clarity of a camera that had no emotional stake in the matter, what had happened on the third-floor balcony. The photographs from inside the hotel room were shown to the jury, images of blood, of the physical evidence of what had taken place before Hannah was carried to the railing. Testimony was presented from a psychiatrist who had evaluated Channel Yanko, and to whom she had admitted, in direct terms, that she had stabbed her daughter 3 times in the back inside the hotel room before throwing her from the balcony. Text messages were entered into evidence. Witness accounts were provided. The Uber request, the call for a car made within 4 minutes of Hannah's fall, was placed before the jury as the piece of evidence that prosecutors argued settled the central question of the trial. That central question was not whether Channel Yanko had killed her daughter. The defense did not argue that she had not. It argued something more nuanced and more fraught, that she had not been in her right mind. That at the moment she picked up the sharp object and used it on Hannah, at the moment she carried her daughter to the balcony and dropped her to the street, she had been in a state of mental illness so severe that she could not appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. The legal standard for insanity in Texas, as in most American jurisdictions, requires more than evidence of mental illness. It requires a finding that the defendant did not know that what she was doing was wrong. The Uber call destroyed that argument. For minutes. In 4 minutes after Hannah fell from the balcony, Channel Yanko had accessed her phone, navigated to a rideshare application, and attempted to arrange transportation out of Galveston. It was a sequence of actions that required the functional operation of a mind capable of recognizing its situation, evaluating its options, and selecting a response designed to avoid consequences. A person who does not know that what they have done is wrong does not immediately attempt to flee the scene of the act. The knowledge embedded in that Uber request, the knowledge that she needed to go, needed to be elsewhere, needed to escape what she had done, was, in the prosecution's argument, the clearest possible evidence that Channel Yanko had known, in the moment she chose to act and in the moments immediately after, that what she was doing was wrong. Prosecutor cursed, in closing arguments that several outlets noted for their controlled intensity, addressed the jury with words that went beyond the technical and into the human. There was one person in the world, Kearse said, who was supposed to love Hannah Yanko unconditionally. One person whose protection and devotion was supposed to be Hannah's most fundamental certainty in the world, whose arms were supposed to be the safest place Hannah knew. That person, Kearse argued, had instead taken Hannah's life. The jury retired to deliberate. They returned in less than 1 hour. 50 minutes, approximately, less time than it takes to watch a single episode of a television program. To weigh 7 days of testimony, surveillance footage, psychiatric evidence, forensic pathology, text messages, photographs, and the closing arguments of both sides, and arrive at a verdict. The speed of the deliberation was, in itself, a statement. 12 people who had just spent a week absorbing the full weight of this case had gone into a room together and emerged with a verdict so quickly that observers in the courtroom had barely had time to settle into the waiting. Guilty. Capital murder. The sentence was automatic. Under Texas law, conviction for capital murder of a person under 10 years of age carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Lonnie Cox formally imposed that sentence on Friday, March 6, 2026. Channel Jasmine Yanko, 30 years old, would spend the remainder of her natural life inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. She would not be eligible for parole. She would not, under the law as it stands, ever walk freely again through a city, or along a seawall, or through the lobby of a hotel. The Galveston County District Attorney's Office issued a statement in the days following the conviction that included an acknowledgement of what the prosecution team had carried through the week of the trial. The case had been described from the beginning as one of the most difficult they had ever faced, not in terms of legal complexity or evidentiary challenge, but in terms of the human toll of being the people responsible for presenting what had been done to a 17-month-old child to a jury, day after day, detail by detail. The prosecutor who had stood before that jury and named the full reality of Hannah's death was doing a job that the law required someone to do, and the statement acknowledged what it had cost. They rarely do in cases like this, cases where the victim is the most vulnerable kind of person imaginable, where the person responsible for the crime was also the person society and law designate as the child's primary protector, where the system that is supposed to identify danger before it becomes catastrophe is asked, after the fact, to account for what it missed. Channel Yanko had come into contact with the child welfare system before. Hannah had not been the subject of those contacts, and Hannah was dead. The Beachfront Palms Hotel on Seawall Boulevard continued to operate after October 2024, the way businesses do, with no mechanism to hold the weight of what had happened on its third floor for very long before the practical demands of operations reasserted themselves. Rooms were cleaned. New guests checked in. The Gulf of Mexico continued doing what it has always done, moving indifferent, neither mourning nor forgetting, simply continuing its long, unbroken rhythm against the Galveston shore. On 59th Street, where Hannah Yanko was found on the pavement, still alive, still breathing, still carrying the impossible small life that would not survive the next hours, there is nothing to mark what happened there. The street is a street. The Kroger is a Kroger. The hotel is a hotel. The city moves around the spot the way it moves around everything, continuously, without pause. Hannah Yanko had lived for 17 months. She had walked through whatever small portion of the world was available to a child of her age. The rooms of wherever she lived, the arms of her mother, the ordinary textures and sounds and light of a life just beginning. She had never had a chance to form a memory she could later articulate, never had the opportunity to become the person she might have been. The question of who Hannah Yanko would have grown into belongs to a future that was closed in October 2024 on a hotel balcony in Galveston, Texas. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The sentence was automatic. The law, in its blunt and absolute way, named what had been done and applied its full consequence. Channel Yanko would grow old inside a prison, or she would not grow old at all, but she would not be free. She would not walk along a seawall or feel the Gulf breeze again. She would not hold another child. The law had done what the law can do, which is to name a thing and respond to it with finality, and to close a door that can never be reopened. What it could not do, what no verdict and no sentence ever can, is give Hannah back. That is the quiet, permanent fact at the center of this case, and at the center of every case like it. The law moved. The jury spoke. The sentence was imposed. And a 17-month-old child remained gone, having lived less time than most people spend planning a vacation, having experienced no more of the world than what a year and a half affords, and having been failed, in the most absolute and irreversible way imaginable, by the one person whose first and most essential obligation was to keep her safe. Story 5. The Alps in January are not a place that forgives mistakes. They are a place of breathtaking beauty and unforgiving cold, where the line between adventure and tragedy can be as thin as the ridge of a summit at midnight. It was on one such ridge, on the spine of Austria's highest peak, that the story of Kirsten Gertner came to its devastating end. Kirsten Gertner was 33 years old, and by all accounts, she carried a warmth that contradicted the mountains she adored. Friends and those who knew her described a woman who was full of life, whose eyes lit up at the mention of snow-capped peaks and the kind of crisp, biting air that most people run from. She called herself a passionate lover of cold weather climes. She was not someone who shied away from adventure. She embraced it with an openness that endeared her to everyone around her. But there is a vast and dangerous difference between loving the cold and being prepared to survive it at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, in the dead of an Austrian winter night. Kirsten had never undertaken an alpine high-altitude tour of the length, difficulty, and altitude of the one she was about to attempt. That gap between passion and preparation, between ambition and experience, would become the fault line along which everything shattered. By her side was Thomas Plamberger, 37 years old, and the man she trusted with her life in the mountains. He was, by every measure, the polar opposite of a novice. Plamberger was an experienced, skilled alpinist who had already climbed Austria's highest peak before, who knew its moods and its dangers, and who had planned this winter ascent himself. He was, in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of those who would later sit in judgment of him, the responsible guide of the tour. Kirsten was following him into one of the most demanding winter ascents in the entire Alpine range. She was trusting him completely. The Grossglockner is not simply Austria's tallest mountain. It is a monument to the extreme. Rising to 3,798 meters, about 12,460 feet, within the Hohe-Tauern range in the heart of the Eastern Alps, it commands the landscape around it with a kind of cold majesty. In summer, it draws thousands of climbers. In winter, it becomes a different animal entirely. The temperatures plunge to merciless lows. The winds that curl around its upper ridges carry ice. The darkness at altitude is complete and disorienting. Even for experienced climbers, a winter summit attempt on the Grossglockner demands meticulous preparation, the right equipment, and above all, an honest assessment of every person making the climb. Plamberger chose to ascend via the Stuttlegrat, a route renowned for its technical difficulty and mixed terrain, rock and ice blending together in a combination that demands specialized footwear, strength, and nerves of steel. For an experienced alpinist in good conditions, it is a formidable challenge. For a first-time high-altitude climber, in the depths of winter, in temperatures that would sink to around minus 20 degrees Celsius, it was something else entirely. On the morning of January 18, 2025, Thomas Plamberger and Kirsten Gertner began their approach to the Grossglockner. But even before they took their first step upward, the seeds of catastrophe had already been sown. They started 2 hours too late. In the alpine world, timing is everything. A delayed start compresses a timetable that already demands precision, pushing the critical, exposed sections of a climb into darkness, into the coldest hours, into the time when the body is at its most vulnerable and the mind is at its most fatigued. Kirsten's footwear was not adequate for the terrain. The mixed rock and ice environment of the Stuttlegrat requires crampons, robust boots designed for exactly this kind of surface, gear that does not compromise, gear that keeps a person anchored to the mountain even when every instinct says to slip. What she wore was not that. It was a detail that seemed small in the planning stages, one of those quiet oversights that only screams its importance in hindsight. Emergency equipment, too, was lacking. The kind of gear that becomes a lifeline when a body temperature begins to drop, when a person can no longer move. It simply was not there in sufficient supply. They climbed through the day and into the night. As the hours passed and the temperature fell, the mountain asserted itself. The wind found the exposed ridges. The darkness pressed in from every side. And somewhere in those hours of cold and effort, Kirsten began to struggle. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on January 19, 2025, the couple was approximately 50 meters, barely 150 feet, below the summit cross of the Grossglockner. 50 meters. A distance you could walk in under a minute on flat ground. But at that altitude, in those conditions, in the state Kirsten was in, it might as well have been the length of the world. She was exhausted. She was hypothermic. Her body temperature had dropped to the point where normal function was compromised. She was disoriented, struggling to process the environment around her. These are the classic signs of a person whose body is losing its battle with the cold. A person in this state cannot be left alone. They cannot warm themselves. They cannot navigate. They cannot call for help. They are, in the starkest sense, at the mercy of whoever is beside them. Thomas Plamberger left. He later said that he descended to the nearest mountain hut to seek help, that he and Kirsten had made a mutual decision for him to go, that she had told him to go. He did not call for help immediately upon reaching the hut. He did not make immediate contact with search teams or police. 6.5 hours passed between the moment he left Kirsten and the moment he returned to the mountain. 6.5 hours in minus 20 degrees, alone, without proper protection, on the edge of the summit of Austria's highest peak. When rescue teams arrived at first light, Kirsten Gertner was already dead. She had frozen to death just meters below the top, within sight of the cross that marks the summit, the goal of the whole terrible journey. In the days that followed, Plamberger did what grieving partners do. On what would later be reported as a now-deleted social media page, he wrote about her in terms of raw, devastating loss. "I miss you so much," he wrote. "It hurts so incredibly much. Forever in my heart. Without you, time is meaningless." The words spoke of genuine anguish. But they could not answer the questions that were forming, not just in the minds of Kirsten's family, but in the minds of the investigators who were beginning to look at the timeline of that night with increasingly hard eyes. The Innsbruck Public Prosecutor's Office launched a formal investigation. For 11 months, they worked methodically and carefully, gathering every piece of data the mountain and the technology had preserved. They spoke to witnesses. They studied the digital footprint of a night that two people had spent on a mountain, and only one had survived. In December 2025, they announced their conclusions. Thomas Plamberger was charged with grossly negligent manslaughter. The charge was built around 9 specific failures, 9 moments where a different choice might have saved Kirsten's life. The late start, the inadequate footwear, the insufficient emergency equipment, the decision not to turn back when conditions deteriorated and Kirsten's limits became clear. The failure to immediately seek help when he reached safety. Each error, in isolation, might have been forgivable. Together, they formed a chain that prosecutors argued had one end: Kirsten's death. The case also rested on a principle deeply embedded in Germanic law, known as a duty of care. The law recognizes that in certain relationships, one person bears a responsibility for the safety of another: a parent with a child, a driver in an accident. In this case, prosecutors argued, Plamberger had assumed that role the moment he planned and led an inexperienced partner on a winter alpine climb. He was the expert. He was the one who knew the mountain. He was the one who had organized every detail of the expedition. The responsibility, in their eyes, had been his. The trial opened in Innsbruck on February 19, 2026, and it drew attention from across the world. Here was a case that touched something universal: the question of what we owe to the people we love when we take them somewhere dangerous. The courtroom was dense with the weight of that question. Around 15 witnesses took the stand over the course of a 14-hour trial. Rescue workers who had retrieved Kirsten's body testified. Law enforcement officers described the investigation. Alpine mountaineering experts laid out the technical realities of the Stuttlegrat in winter. And then, in one of the most unexpected moments of the trial, a woman named Andrea, Plamberger's former girlfriend, stepped forward. She testified that once before, on the very same mountain, in the dark of a night descent of the Grossglockner, Plamberger had disappeared. "Once we descended the Glockner at night, he suddenly vanished," she told the court. "I felt lightheaded. I screamed, and I was completely alone." She said that after that night, they never went hiking together again. The testimony landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. It suggested a pattern, a habit, perhaps, of leaving others behind on this very mountain, in this very darkness. Kirsten's mother, Gertraud Gertner, also testified. Her appearance in the courtroom was one of the most emotionally charged moments of the proceedings. And yet, in a moment that surprised many observers, she expressed disbelief that Plamberger was to blame for her daughter's death. A mother standing in the courtroom, looking at the man who had been with her daughter in her final hours, and saying she could not hold him responsible. The human capacity for grief, for forgiveness, for complexity, was present in that moment in a way that no legal framework could fully contain. Plamberger himself addressed the court with visible emotion. "I am profoundly sorry for what transpired," he said. He maintained that he loved Kirsten, that the decisions made on the mountain had been made together. He was, he insisted, not a murderer. He was not a negligent man who had thrown away a life. He was a grieving partner who had lost the person he loved most. Judge Norbert Hofer had presided over the trial without a jury, hearing every piece of testimony, weighing every piece of evidence, and considering the law as it applied to the facts. When he delivered his verdict at the end of that long day, he did so with a rare combination of compassion and moral clarity. He found Thomas Plamberger guilty. The sentence was a 5-month suspended prison sentence and a fine of approximately €9,600. The suspension meant Plamberger would not serve time behind bars, but the conviction itself was real and binding, a formal finding that his actions had caused Kirsten's death. Before delivering the sentence, the judge spoke directly to Plamberger, and what he said was as powerful as any verdict. "Mr. Plamberger, you have carried an immense burden. You lost someone," the judge said. "She entrusted her safety to you, expecting that you would ensure her safe passage. And then, with a certainty that seemed to carry the weight of the mountain itself, had you acted differently, I firmly believe your partner would have survived." He did not spare the defendant from a hard truth about his character, either. "You are a skilled alpinist," Judge Hofer told Plamberger, "but you struggle to differentiate between your own limits and those of others." In those few words, the judge had identified something essential: the quiet arrogance of expertise, the failure to see that what one person can endure another person cannot. The inability to look at the person beside you and understand, truly understand, where their limits end and the danger begins. Kirsten Gertner's story did not end in a courtroom. It continued, the way all true tragedies continue, in the people left to carry it. Her mother, her friends, the broader community of people who, reading the details of that night, found themselves unable to look away from the image of a 33-year-old woman alone on the top of the world, in the dark, in the cold, waiting for someone to come back. The case also sparked a much wider conversation, one that reached far beyond the borders of Austria. It asked, in the most urgent terms, what responsibility we bear for the people we lead into dangerous places. It examined whether love alone is enough preparation for risk. It tested the idea that mutual agreement can never truly exist when one person holds all the knowledge and the other person holds none. The Grossglockner did not change after Kirsten died. It remained what it had always been, silent, monumental, indifferent. The summit cross still stood at 3,798 meters. The winter winds still scoured the upper ridges. The webcam that had captured the last footage of two people climbing together continued to record the mountain's daily life. But 50 meters below that cross, in the darkness of a January night, a young woman had died alone, cold, and waiting. And the world, having learned her name, would not easily forget it. Story 6. There is a darkness that hides behind charm, behind a bright smile, a well-pressed coat, and the easy confidence of someone who has spent a lifetime pretending. Sante Kims wore that darkness like a second skin. She was, by nearly every account, electrifying in person, a woman who could walk into a room and make every man in it feel like the center of the world. But beneath the shimmer, there was something cold and methodical, something that had been taking shape since before she was old enough to understand what she was becoming. She was born Sandra Louise Singers on July 24, 1934, in Oklahoma City, the product of an East Indian father and an Irish mother. By the time she was a small child, her father had abandoned the family, leaving her mother to raise the children in desperate poverty. The years that followed were unstable and scarring. She emerged from childhood with a profound hunger, not just for money, but for the feeling of power that money represented. She discovered early on that she had a gift. She could lie without flinching. She could invent identities, adopt personas, and slip between social worlds with fluid ease. By the time she was a young woman, she had already begun a pattern of petty crime, shoplifting furs from department stores, a habit that would dog her for decades. She married twice before finding her most significant partnership, Kenneth Kims Sr., a wealthy motel and hotel developer who gave her the lifestyle she had always craved. She became Mrs. Kims, a millionaire's wife who wore fine clothes and moved in influential circles. And yet, even with a fortune at her disposal, she could not stop stealing. Investigators and psychologists who later studied her case noted that the fraud was never purely about money. It was about control. It was about dominance. Kenneth Kims Jr. entered the world not as a child so much as a prop, raised by nannies, educated by private tutors, and shuttled between his parents' homes in Las Vegas, Honolulu, the Bahamas, La Jolla, and Santa Barbara. He grew up surrounded by luxury and lies in equal measure. By the time he was a teenager, FBI raids were a feature of his childhood rather than an exception. His mother's 1985 arrest and conviction for keeping undocumented Central American women in involuntary servitude, essentially enslaving them in her Las Vegas home, threatening to report them to immigration authorities if they tried to leave, sent her to federal prison for several years, shattering whatever remaining illusion of normalcy Kenny might have held onto. He spoke of his mother with a kind of bewildered grief, acknowledging her terrifying charisma and her absolute authority over his life. "My mom could make every man in the room feel like the most important person on the planet," he said. But he also understood, looking back across the decades, that her charm was a weapon she used on everyone, including her own son. He had dropped out of the University of California at Santa Barbara in 1996 at her urging, surrendering the last normal path available to him. After that, he was hers entirely. By the mid-1990s, Kenneth Kimes Sr. was dead. He passed away in 1994 from an aneurysm, and Sante and her son were operating as a unit, a traveling criminal enterprise that left a debris field of fraud, forgery, arson, and ultimately murder across several states and countries. Their first confirmed killing took place in the early months of 1998. David Kasdan was an old friend, a Los Angeles businessman who had made the mistake of trusting Sante. She had forged his signature to take out a loan of approximately $280,000. When Kasdan discovered what had happened through a letter from his bank and threatened to expose her, Sante made a decision that demonstrated, with chilling clarity, exactly what she was capable of. She told her son that Kasdan would have to be killed. On March 9, 1998, Kenneth Jr. went to Kasdan's home in Los Angeles and shot him in the back of the head. The body was found in a dumpster near Los Angeles International Airport days later. The murder weapon was never recovered. It had been disassembled and dropped into a storm drain. Sante and Kenny moved on without pausing, the way people move through rooms they intend never to return to. At the other end of the country, on a quiet, tree-lined street on Manhattan's Upper East Side, there lived a woman who could not have been more different from Sante Kimes in spirit, though the two were nearly the same generation. Irene Zumbelli Silverman was born on April 17, 1916, in New Orleans to a Greek-Italian immigrant family. She was gifted and graceful, a young woman who trained under the legendary choreographer Mikhail Fakin, and went on to dance in the Corps de Ballet at Radio City Music Hall and on Broadway. She was an artist, a woman of culture and warmth. In 1941, she married Samuel Silverman, a multimillionaire mortgage banker, and together they made their home in a magnificent Beaux-Arts limestone townhouse at 20 East 65th Street, just steps from Central Park. The house was a treasure, a 25-foot wide, approximately 12,500 square foot mansion that would eventually be valued at somewhere between $7 and $10 million. When Samuel died in 1980, Irene did not retreat into isolation. Instead, she transformed the townhouse into a small, supremely elegant boarding house, renting out 7 or 8 apartments at between $6,000 and $10,000 a month. She loved company, loved interesting people. Her tenants over the years were artists, businesspeople, world travelers, individuals who added color and life to the grand old house. She kept a large painting of herself in a ballet tutu in the living room, a reminder of a life richly lived. In 1994, she established the Kobe Foundation, a philanthropic organization dedicated to funding textile and needle arts projects at museums around the country, and in time it would distribute millions of dollars in grants. At 82 years old, Irene Silverman was small in stature, just 5 feet tall, weighing barely 115 pounds, but enormous in spirit. She was precisely the kind of target Sante Kimes had been looking for. Sante and Kenny first learned about Irene Silverman and her valuable Manhattan townhouse at a conference in Las Vegas. Whether it was a real estate seminar or some other gathering, what mattered was the information that followed. Sante confirmed through a Florida title company that Irene Silverman was the sole owner of the property at 20 East 65th Street, and that the home carried no liens. It was free and clear, worth millions, and belonging entirely to one elderly woman living alone. In April 1998, just weeks after the Kasdan murder, mother and son relocated to Florida, where they began laying out the details of what they planned to do. The scheme was audacious in its coldness. They would gain entry to the house. Kenny would pose as a tenant, present himself as charming and respectable, and once inside, they would forge documents transferring the property into their control. Then Irene Silverman would simply have to disappear. Sante filled spiral-bound notebooks with the architecture of her plan. She sketched floor plans of the townhouse. She recorded the names and schedules of Irene's staff. She practiced forging Irene's signature again and again, filling pages with the careful loops of another woman's name. She noted Irene's social security number. She prepared a deed that purported to transfer the townhouse to a shell company called Atlantis Group Limited for approximately $395,000, a staggering undervaluation of a property worth many times that amount. Into a bag, they loaded 2 loaded firearms, plastic handcuffs, duct tape, syringes, and a potent sedative. On June 14, 1998, a well-dressed, pleasant-faced 23-year-old man arrived at the door of 20 East 65th Street and introduced himself as Manny Guerin, a businessman from Palm Beach. He offered $6,000 in cash for apartment 1B. Irene Silverman, charmed by the young man's manners and his apparent affluence, welcomed him in. Within days, Sante had quietly moved into the apartment alongside her son, presenting herself as his assistant. For a few weeks, the illusion held. But something about the new tenant nagged at Irene. He was pleasant enough, yet there was something she couldn't quite place, a watchfulness about him, an evasiveness when she asked simple questions. She noticed that he seemed to observe the house and its routines with more interest than a casual renter would have. She began writing notes to herself about her suspicions. She told friends she was going to remove him. On the evening of July 4th, 1998, the night before she disappeared, Irene hosted 2 friends for dinner. It was a warm summer evening, and she was in good spirits, though she mentioned her unease about the young man in apartment 1B. She said she had made up her mind. He would be asked to leave. It was the last time anyone outside the Kims family would see Irene Silverman alive. On July 5th, 1998, as the city hummed quietly in the early summer heat, Kenny cornered Irene near her office inside the townhouse. Sante moved to the television and turned up the volume, filling the house with noise. It was methodical, planned. Irene, 82 years old, barely over 100 pounds, was helpless against the young man who tackled her. Sante reportedly shocked her with a stun gun, and then came the 2 words that Kenny would carry with him for the rest of his life. His mother looked at him and said simply, "Do it." He strangled her. Afterward, they wrapped Irene Silverman's body in garbage bags and placed it inside a duffel bag. Using her own keys, they carried her out of the house she had loved for decades. Kenny later told investigators and prosecutors that he disposed of the body at a construction site in northern New Jersey, perhaps Hoboken, though Irene's remains have never been found. That same evening, federal agents apprehending Sante and Kenny outside the New York Hilton Hotel on an unrelated warrant from Utah had no idea they had just caught 2 people who hours earlier had committed murder. When officers searched the bag they were carrying, they found the notebooks. They found the forged deed. They found the firearms, the handcuffs, the duct tape. They found Irene's keys and documents in Kenny's possession, along with over $10,000 in cash. The evidence did not point ambiguously in any direction. It spoke with awful clarity. The Kims trial, which began in New York in February 2000, was unlike almost any other murder prosecution in American legal history. There was no body. Irene Silverman had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. In almost any other circumstance, prosecutors would have faced an impossible burden of proof. But Sante had done something remarkable in her arrogance. She had documented everything. The notebooks were a map of a murder, written in her own hand. The forged signatures, the floor plans, the schedule of the staff, the rehearsed lies, all of it was there in careful, damning detail. Over 3 months, the jury heard it all. They heard about the aliases, the forged deed, the weapons, the sedatives. They heard about the life of Irene Silverman, the dancer, the philanthropist, the woman who had opened her home to strangers and found, at the end of her long and generous life, that she had opened it to the wrong ones. Sante chose not to take the stand, knowing that if she did, prosecutors could cross-examine her about her previous convictions. She attempted, even from the defense table, to speak to journalists in ways the judge feared might influence the jury, and was repeatedly reined in. On May 18, 2000, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Sante Kims and Kenneth Kims Jr. were convicted of second-degree murder. They were also found guilty of 117 additional charges, including robbery, burglary, conspiracy, grand larceny, illegal weapons possession, forgery, and eavesdropping. The jury had voted unanimously on their very first poll. A month later, the sentences were handed down. Sante received more than 120 years to life in prison, and Kenny received more than 125 years to life. The story did not end in that New York courtroom. In 2004, Sante and Kenny were extradited to California to face trial for the murder of David Kasdan. Kenny, confronting the possibility of the death penalty, made a decision that his mother never forgave. He accepted a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Sante and entering a guilty plea, he would avoid execution. On the stand, he confirmed what investigators had long suspected. He had killed Kasdan on his mother's orders. He also confessed to the murder of Irene Silverman, providing the full, terrible details of what had happened in the townhouse on East 65th Street. He further admitted that he and Sante had drugged and drowned a Bahamian banker named Syed Bilal Ahmed in 1996, after Ahmed grew suspicious of their financial manipulations and dumped his body in the ocean. Sante, he said, had also confided to him that she had killed an arson partner named Elmer Ambrose Holmgren in Costa Rica, though no charges were ever brought in that case. Sante received a life sentence for the Kasdan murder, to be served alongside her New York sentence. She was transferred to the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, where her earliest possible release date was listed as the year 2119. She maintained her innocence until the very end, accusing police of mishandling evidence and denying every charge brought against her. Sante Kims died on May 19, 2014, at the age of 79, inside the walls of Bedford Hills. She had spent the last 16 years of her life in a prison cell, stripped of the aliases, the fine clothes, the charm offensives, and the freedom to reinvent herself. The woman who had spent 6 decades constructing and deconstructing identities died as what she had always been, a prisoner of her own nature. Kenneth Kims Jr., who turned 49 in 2024, remains incarcerated at the correctional facility in California, serving a life sentence. Irene Silverman's townhouse at 20 East 65th Street eventually sold for approximately $11.5 million. The Kobe Foundation, the philanthropic institution she built in the final years of her life, continued its work and distributed upwards of $10 million in grants to textile arts programs at museums across the country. The work of her hands outlasted her. Her body was never recovered. What the Kims case ultimately exposed was not merely the horror of 2 specific murders, but something more unsettling about the nature of crime when it hides in plain sight, when it wears a good coat and a confident smile and speaks in the language of respectability. Sante Kims was not a shadowy figure lurking in the margins. She was, for much of her life, a woman at dinner tables, at conferences, at social functions, operating her machinery of deceit in full public view. And beside her always was her son, a young man who had been so thoroughly shaped by her that when the moment of terrible decision came, he lacked the inner scaffolding to refuse. The notebook Sante left behind, those meticulous, damning spiral-bound records of a plan to steal a home and erase the woman living in it, became one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence in American criminal history. They were the confession she never gave in court. They were, in the end, the truest thing she ever wrote. Story 7. The house on a winding lane in Forest Hills, one of Nashville's most affluent enclaves, was more than just a structure of wood and stone. For Janet Levine March, it was a testament, a dream rendered in glass and light, perched on a 5-acre wooded lot she had found herself. She had designed it from the ground up, a sprawling, 6,000-square-foot contemporary masterpiece that seemed to float among the Tennessee trees. Every line, every window, every open space was a brushstroke from her own imagination, a canvas for the life she was building. By 1996, that life appeared as polished and perfect as the home she had created. Janet was a talented artist, a painter whose vibrant, whimsical creations were beginning to find their audience. She was a mother to two beautiful children, 6-year-old Sammy and 2-year-old Zipra, known as Tsipi. And she was the wife of Perry March, a charismatic and ambitious lawyer. To the outside world, they were a golden couple, living a life of privilege and promise that Janet's wealthy and devoted parents, Larry and Carolyn Levine, had helped make possible. Larry, a successful attorney himself, had proudly paid Perry's way through Vanderbilt Law School. When Perry graduated, he joined his father-in-law's firm. The Levines adored their daughter, and by extension, they had embraced Perry as a son. His own mother had died in a tragic accident when he was just a boy, and Carolyn, in many ways, had become a maternal figure to him. They lived just a few miles from the Levines, a tight-knit family unit seemingly insulated from the harsher realities of the world. Janet had everything she had ever planned for: the loving marriage, the beautiful family, the spectacular home, and a burgeoning art career. But within the walls of her dream house, a different reality was taking shape, one of hidden tensions and simmering resentments that were about to shatter the perfect facade. On the evening of August 15, 1996, the carefully constructed world of Janet March began to unravel. According to Perry, the night started with an ordinary family dinner. Afterward, he put the children to bed, and then, he claimed, a familiar argument with Janet ignited once more. He would later describe it as the kind of argument a couple has when they are simply tired of arguing. But this one, he said, was different. It ended with a decision. Janet, he told everyone, had decided to take a vacation. Alone. She packed a few bags, her passport, and a small amount of cash. She was leaving for 12 days, he said, and planned to return on August 27th, just in time for their son Sammy's 6th birthday. Before she left, Perry claimed she had him sit down and sign a handwritten to-do list, a catalog of chores and tasks he had neglected. Clean the basement, balance the checkbook, change the light bulbs. It was, in his telling, her final, parting shot in their domestic squabble. Then, with a simple, "See ya," she walked out the door, started her gray Volvo, and drove off into the warm summer night. Around midnight, the phone rang at the Levine residence. It was Perry. He told Carolyn that Janet had left after a fight. Carolyn, ever the calming influence, tried to soothe him. "Don't worry about it," she told him. "She's probably just driving around to cool off. She'll be back. Call me when she comes home." But Janet didn't come home. The next morning, there was no call. Carolyn's worry began to curdle into a quiet dread. She knew her daughter had an appointment to see a divorce lawyer the very next day, an appointment she had asked Carolyn to attend with her. It was a detail that made Perry's story of a spontaneous vacation feel jarringly out of place. Days bled into one another. Perry claimed he initially thought it was a stunt, a dramatic gesture to make him appreciate the pressures she was under. He called a few hotels. He and Larry Levine drove to the airport to check the parking lots for her Volvo. But there was no sign of her. No phone calls to check on the children she adored. No credit card activity. Janet March had vanished. Strangely, for 2 full weeks, no one called the police. Perry would later insist that the Levines had forbidden it, worried about embarrassing Janet. The Levines would claim the exact opposite, that Perry was the one who resisted involving the authorities, preferring to hire a private investigator. It was the first of many irreconcilable cracks in the story of what happened that August. Finally, 2 weeks after Janet was last seen, Perry and his father-in-law walked into a Nashville police station and reported her missing. By then, the trail was already cold. For Detective Mickey Miller of the Nashville Police, it began as just another missing person case. But the details didn't add up. The timeline Perry provided was troubling. He said Janet planned to be gone for 12 days, returning on August 27th, Sammy's birthday. But Janet had already sent out invitations for Sammy's birthday party. The party was scheduled for August 25th, 2 days before her supposed return. A friend of Janet's confirmed she had spoken to her on the evening of August 15th to arrange a play date for their sons for the very next day. It was not the action of a woman planning to leave the state. Then came the discovery that solidified their worst fears. A week into the investigation, police found Janet's Volvo. It was parked in the lot of an apartment complex a few miles from the March home. Inside were her personal effects, including her passport, a bag, and a small amount of cash. Her keys were on the floorboard. For Janet's friends and family, the final sliver of hope was extinguished. Whatever had happened, she had not left willingly. Janet would never, ever have missed her son's birthday party. She would never have abandoned her children. 3 weeks after she disappeared, with her car found and no trace of her on any paper trail, police reclassified the case. This was no longer a missing person investigation. It was a homicide, and their prime suspect was the only person known to have seen her last, her husband, Perry March. The investigation immediately zeroed in on the March home. Perry, now communicating through a lawyer, refused to be interviewed further and denied police permission to search the house. Armed with a warrant, investigators descended on the property 1 month after Janet's disappearance, ready to dismantle the dream house piece by piece in search of a crime scene. Nashville crime scene investigator Johnny Hunter and his team were meticulous. We vacuumed all the floors. We collected the vacuum bags out of the vacuums that belonged here. We even processed these hardwood floors for fingerprints and palm prints, Hunter recalled. They combed the surrounding woods, dragged nearby lakes and a river. But they found nothing. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no trace of Janet. And crucially, no body. The house that Janet built held its secrets close. What they didn't find, however, was just as telling. Perry had told police that the infamous to-do list Janet had supposedly written was created on their home computer. That list was the only piece of physical evidence that supported his version of events. Investigators were desperate to get their hands on the computer's hard drive, believing it could prove who had actually written the list and when. But when they went to retrieve it, the hard drive was gone. Perry denied removing it, instead pointing the finger at his own father, Arthur March, who had come to stay with him after Janet vanished, and at his father-in-law, Larry Levine. Both men denied it. Arthur, a gruff and eccentric figure, claimed he didn't even know what a hard drive was. The missing component became a black hole at the center of the investigation, a piece of the puzzle that was either lost or deliberately removed. Investigators also grew suspicious about the tires on Perry's Jeep. Just 6 days after Janet's disappearance, Perry had all 4 tires replaced. He claimed it was just another item on Janet's list, that the old tires were bald. But the tire company employees told a different story. They told police the tires did not need to be changed and recalled Perry saying he simply wanted a different brand. It seemed like a man trying to erase his tracks, but without knowing where those tracks had led, police were stymied. Then a witness came forward. A woman who had brought her son to the March house for the scheduled play date on the morning of August 16th told police a strange story. She said she arrived to find the house quiet. After getting no answer at the door, she let herself in, calling for Janet. As she walked down the hall, she heard Perry's voice from behind the closed door of his study. He asked who was there and then sent her away. But before she left, she noticed something odd blocking the doorway. A large, rolled-up oriental rug that she had never seen in the house before. When Sammy, the March's son, returned home later that day, the rug was gone. Investigators had never found such a rug, and Perry denied its existence. Police now had a chilling theory. After killing Janet, Perry had wrapped her body in the rug and disposed of it in a location he had yet to reveal. But a theory wasn't enough. Without a body, a murder weapon, or a confession, the case against Perry March was entirely circumstantial, and it was going cold. As the police investigation stalled, a different kind of war was just beginning. The Levines, now unconditionally convinced that Perry had murdered their daughter, made their move. The day Perry was named a suspect, they filed a court action to prevent him from taking the children out of the state. But they were too late. That very day, Perry packed up Sammy and Tsipi and moved to Chicago. It was a declaration of war. The Levines followed, filing for visitation rights in a Chicago court. For 2 years, the families battled through the legal system. Finally, the court granted the Levines weekend visitation. But on the day the agreement was to be finalized in the spring of 1999, Perry March was a no-show. He had fled again, this time beyond the reach of U.S. courts. He took the children and disappeared into Mexico. He settled in Ajijic, a picturesque lakeside town popular with American expatriates, where his father, Arthur, had retired years earlier. I moved to Mexico because I needed to get the hell out of Dodge and start a new life, and get out of their clutches, Perry later said. He quickly built a new life, meeting a local woman named Carmen Rojas, marrying her within a year, and blending their 2 families. He told his children that their mother had simply left home and that no one knew what had happened to her. He opened a new business and tried to close the chapter on his life in Nashville. But the Levines were relentless. Deprived of their daughter and now their grandchildren, they refused to give up. 2 months after Perry fled, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him. When Perry failed to appear in the Nashville court to contest it, the judge ruled against him, finding him wrongfully responsible for causing her death. For the Levines, it was a moral victory, but it didn't bring them any closer to their grandchildren. In May 2000, they took a drastic step. Armed with U.S. court orders, they flew to Ajijik and showed up at Perry's door, demanding to see Sammy and Tsipi. Perry refused. Defeated, they returned to Nashville. But a month later, they tried again, this time with a more elaborate plan. Tipped off by the FBI that Mexican immigration officials were planning to detain Perry, the Levines coordinated with a local judge and police. As Perry was lured to his office and grabbed by plainclothes officers, the Levines' convoy pulled up to the children's school. The scene was chaos. Perry's father, Arthur, got wind of the plan and raced to the school, confronting Larry Levine with threats. "I believed that he would try and kill us." "Absolutely," Larry later said. Meanwhile, Perry, held in a van by armed men, realized he was being taken to the airport for deportation. In a moment of quick thinking, he dropped the name of a high-ranking immigration official he knew, bluffing that his paperwork was in order. The captors made a call. Minutes later, they apologized for the terrible mistake and released him. Perry sped towards the school, enraged, but he was too late. After a tense standoff, school administrators had handed Sammy and Tsipi over to the Mexican judge, who delivered them to their grandparents. By the time Perry arrived, they were gone, en route to the airport, with Arthur March in hot pursuit behind them. The Levines managed to lose him and board a plane. Within 24 hours, the children were back in Nashville. Perry was apoplectic, calling it a kidnapping, but his victory was short-lived. Perry's American lawyers found a loophole. An international treaty, the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, which states that custody determinations cannot be made in the jurisdiction where children were wrongfully removed to. A U.S. federal court agreed and ordered the Levines to return the children to their father in Mexico with all due speed. The Levines had lost their grandchildren once again. For several years, it seemed Perry March had won. He was living freely in Mexico with his new family, his children back under his roof. The investigation into Janet's murder was dormant. But in Nashville, the case had been handed over to the Cold Case Unit, specifically to detectives Pat Postiglione and Bill Pridemore. They were tenacious investigators, known for breathing life into dead-end cases. Starting in 2002, they began meticulously re-examining every piece of evidence, re-interviewing every witness. They painstakingly built a circumstantial case, brick by brick. They focused on Perry's lies and inconsistencies. They had the friend who had the playdate scheduled. They had the party invitations that contradicted Perry's timeline. They had the witness who saw the mysterious rolled-up rug. And they had new witnesses. One was a resident of the apartment complex where Janet's Volvo was found. He testified that he returned home from work late on the night of August 15th and saw a man he later identified as Perry March, looking surprised as he walked a mountain bike through the parking lot. Investigators theorized he had driven Janet's car there, abandoned it, and biked back home. In December 2004, after 2.5 years of relentless work, the detectives took their case to a secret grand jury. 59 witnesses testified. In the end, the grand jury handed down an indictment against Perry March for the second-degree murder of his wife, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. The indictment remained sealed. Perry, living his life in Ajijik, had no idea he was now a wanted man. The next step was to get him back onto U.S. soil. The FBI and Nashville police worked with Mexican officials. On the morning of August 3, 2005, nearly 9 years after Janet's disappearance, the trap was sprung. As Perry arrived at the cafe he owned, he was apprehended by Mexican immigration authorities. His visa, they told him, had been revoked. He was being deported immediately. He wasn't allowed to say goodbye to his wife or children. He was driven directly to the Guadalajara airport, placed on a flight to Los Angeles, and arrested by detectives Postiglione and Pridemore the moment he landed in the United States. Back in Nashville, Perry March, now in a jail cell, prepared for the trial he had evaded for nearly a decade. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial, a web of lies, suspicious actions, and damning witness testimony. They presented the evidence of the new tires and the missing hard drive. They brought in the witness who saw Perry with the mountain bike near the abandoned car. Lab technicians testified that mitochondrial DNA from a hair found in the back of the Volvo was consistent with Janet's. Fiber evidence from Perry's Jeep matched the colors of the mysterious oriental rug that a witness had described. The prosecution had one final, shocking piece of evidence: a witness who could speak to Perry's character and motives like no other, his own father. Arthur March, now in his 70s, had been arrested in Mexico on separate charges. A bizarre and chilling plot hatched with Perry from jail to hire a fellow inmate to murder Larry and Carolyn Levine. Facing a long prison sentence, Arthur took a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to testify against his own son. The jury was shown a videotaped deposition of Arthur March. With the Levines watching from the gallery, Arthur, bitter and unrepentant, unleashed a torrent of venom. He said he had fantasized about killing the Levines for years, calling them liars and political animals. He sneered at their daughter, calling Janet a typical Jewish-American princess, and claiming Perry was there merely for show purposes. It was a portrait of a family consumed by hatred and greed, and it painted Perry not as a grieving husband, but as a man who saw his wife and her family as obstacles. In August 2006, a Nashville jury found Perry March guilty on all counts: second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to a total of 56 years in prison. To this day, Perry March maintains his innocence. And to this day, the body of Janet March has never been found. The dream house she designed and built was sold long ago. Her children, Sammy and Tsipi, were raised by the grandparents who fought so fiercely for them and for justice for their daughter. The final, brutal secret of what happened on that August night in 1996 remains buried somewhere, known only to the man who drove away from a perfect life, leaving nothing but questions and a silence that has lasted for decades. Story 8. The landscape of central Wisconsin is one of quiet, unassuming severity. It is a place of flat, sprawling farmland punctuated by dense woods, where the winters are long and brutal, and the summers are a brief, humid reprieve. In the mid-20th century, life here, particularly in small, isolated communities like Plainfield, was governed by the rhythms of agriculture, the bonds of family, and a deep-seated Lutheran piety. It was a world of hard work and simple faith, where neighbors knew each other's business, but a certain stoic privacy was respected. It was a place where evil was something read about in the Bible or heard of in distant, godless cities, not something that could fester and grow in the dark, fertile soil of their own backyards. It was on one such patch of land, a secluded 155-acre farmstead just outside of town, that the Gein family made their home. But this was no idyllic rural haven. It was an island of isolation, a fortress of dysfunction ruled by the iron will and poisoned tongue of Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. Born in 1878, Augusta was a woman of fervent, almost fanatical religious belief. She saw the world as a cesspool of sin and depravity, a place where the devil lay in wait at every turn. Her husband, George, was a drunkard and a failure in her eyes, a man prone to violent outbursts who was incapable of holding down a steady job. She held him in contempt, but her true venom was reserved for the world outside her farm, and especially for other women, whom she saw as vessels of promiscuity and temptation. Into this toxic environment, 2 sons were born, Henry the Elder, and on August 27, 1906, Edward Theodore Gein. From their earliest days, Augusta dominated their lives. She moved the family to the remote Plainfield farm precisely to cut them off from outside influences. Every afternoon, she would gather her boys and read to them from the Bible, her voice a low, insistent drone as she focused on the most gruesome passages of the Old Testament, tales of death, murder, and divine retribution. She preached to them about the innate immorality of the world, instilling in them a paralyzing fear of sin and a profound distrust of human connection. Ed, a shy and socially awkward boy with a strange, unnerving laugh, became the primary target of his mother's suffocating attention. He was punished for any attempt to make friends, his social development stunted and warped. While Henry, the older brother, grew to resent their mother's tyranny and would occasionally stand up to her, Ed idolized her. Her words were his gospel, her worldview his reality. He became pathologically attached to her, a devotion that bordered on obsession. His world was the farm, his only companion the domineering woman, who was both his jailer and his god. The first crack in this hermetically sealed world came on April 1st, 1940, when George Gein, the family's weak and abusive patriarch, died of heart failure. His death barely registered in the suffocating dynamic of the household. Ed and Henry, now grown men, began taking on odd jobs around Plainfield to make ends meet. They were known as reliable, if quiet, workers. Ed, in particular, developed a reputation as a trustworthy babysitter. He seemed to relate more easily to children than to adults, his own emotional growth having been arrested in a state of perpetual adolescence. Henry, however, began to pull away. He started dating a divorced mother of two and made plans to move out, a clear act of defiance against their mother's worldview. He grew increasingly worried about Ed's slavish devotion to Augusta and would often speak ill of her in his brother's presence, trying to break the spell. Ed would react with shock and hurt, unable to comprehend any criticism of the woman he worshipped. The tension between the brothers and between Henry and his mother was a silent, simmering war in the quiet of the farmhouse. On May 16, 1944, that war reached a mysterious and tragic conclusion. Ed and Henry were out in the fields, burning away marsh vegetation on the property. The fire grew out of control, spreading quickly and drawing the attention of the local fire department. When the flames were finally extinguished and the firefighters had departed, Ed reported that his brother was missing. A search party was formed, and as they combed the scorched land with lanterns, it was Ed who led them directly to Henry's body. He was lying face down, untouched by the fire. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation from the smoke, a heart attack. But there were whispers. Later reports would note that the body had bruises on its head. No autopsy was performed, no official investigation conducted. The possibility of foul play was dismissed. But a seed of doubt was planted, a dark question that would linger for years. Had Ed, in a twisted act of loyalty to his mother, silenced the one voice of dissent in their unholy trinity? Now, Ed had his mother all to himself. But their time together was short. Shortly after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a paralyzing stroke that left her bedridden. Ed became her sole, devoted caretaker, tending to her every need, his life shrinking to the four walls of her sick room. The outside world ceased to exist. His devotion was absolute, his purpose singular. Then, on December 29, 1945, Augusta Gein died. At the age of 39, Ed Gein was utterly and completely alone in the world. His only friend, his one true love, the architect of his entire being, was gone. The silence that fell over the farmhouse was absolute, and in that silence, a monster began to stir. The death of his mother shattered Ed Gein's fragile psyche. He was adrift, a man-child lost in a world he had been taught to fear and despise. His first act was to preserve his mother's memory. He sealed off the rooms she had used most, her bedroom, the upstairs, the downstairs parlor, turning them into a pristine shrine, untouched by time and dust. He then retreated to a small, squalid room off the kitchen, where he lived amidst a growing chaos of filth and decay. The rest of the house became a reflection of his own deteriorating mind. To fill the void left by his mother, Gein turned to reading. But he was not drawn to literature or history. He became engrossed in the lurid world of pulp magazines, adventure stories, and anatomical textbooks. He was fascinated by tales of cannibals, headhunters, and Nazi atrocities, particularly the stories of Ilse Koch, the Bitch of Buchenwald, who was said to have made lampshades and other items from the skin of murdered prisoners. He began to study the female anatomy with a morbid, academic curiosity. He was a man consumed by an obsession with the two things his mother had taught him were the most profound forces in the world: women and death. Sometime between 1947 and 1952, this dark obsession took a terrifying new form. Gein began making nocturnal visits to the local cemeteries. He would later claim to have been in a daze-like state during these excursions. Under the cover of darkness, he began to exhume the bodies of recently buried women, specifically middle-aged women who, in his twisted mind, resembled his mother. He was not, by his own account, always successful. On many nights, he would come to in the middle of the act, leave the grave in good order, and return home empty-handed. But on other nights, he would succeed. He would haul the corpses back to his ramshackle house, this man of slight build performing feats of impossible strength, driven by a force he could not comprehend. Back in the grotesque laboratory of his farmhouse, he began his work. He taught himself how to tan human skin, and with a craftsman's bizarre patience, he started to create. He was not a killer, not yet. He was a scavenger, a ghoul. His project was one of resurrection, in a way. He was trying to bring his mother back. He began to fashion a woman's suit from the skin of these dead women, a complete torso with breasts, so that he could, in the most literal and horrifying way imaginable, crawl into his mother's skin. He denied ever having sexual relations with the bodies he exhumed. They smelled too bad, he would explain with a chilling, dispassionate logic. His project was not one of lust, but of a desperate, pathological longing for reunion. For years, Ed Gein lived this secret, double life. To the people of Plainfield, he was just Odd Eddie, the quiet, harmless handyman and babysitter who lived alone out on the old Gein place. He kept shrunken heads in his house, which he explained away to the few people who saw them as relics sent by a cousin from the Philippines. They were, in fact, human faces, carefully peeled from skulls and used as masks. But no one suspected the true depths of his depravity. He was a ghost in their midst, his horrors hidden in plain sight. But the ghoulish fantasy was not enough. The need to possess, to control, to stop the promiscuous women his mother had railed against, began to curdle into something more active, more violent. The body snatcher was about to become a killer. His first confirmed victim was Mary Hogan, the 51-year-old owner of a local tavern. Hogan was a boisterous, independent woman, perhaps the kind of woman Augusta Gein would have despised. On December 8, 1954, she vanished from her tavern. A pool of blood was found on the floor, a spent .32 caliber cartridge case nearby. The case baffled investigators. Mary Hogan was simply gone. Gein would later confess to shooting her and taking her body back to his farm. Her head was found in a box in his house, a face mask made from her skin in a paper bag. But at the time, his involvement was pure speculation. The trail went cold, and for 3 years, Gein retreated back into his world of graves and skin. The end of Ed Gein's reign of terror began on the cold, bleak morning of November 16, 1957. Bernice Wardens, the 58-year-old owner of the Plainfield hardware store, was at work. Gein had been in the store the previous evening and had said he would return the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. That morning he did. He was her last customer. The last receipt she ever wrote was for that gallon of antifreeze. What happened next is a matter of brutal simplicity. Gein shot her with a .22 caliber rifle from the store, loaded her body into the hardware store's truck, and drove back to his farm. The store was quiet that day. Most of the men in town were out for the start of deer hunting season. Around 5 p.m., Bernice's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Wardens, entered the store to check on his mother. He found the place empty, the cash register open, and a dark trail of blood leading out the back door. His mind immediately went to Ed Gein. He knew Gein had been in the store, and he knew the man was strange. It was a hunter's instinct, a gut feeling that would prove to be terrifyingly accurate. Frank Wardens and the county sheriff, Art Schley, drove out to the Gein farm as the winter twilight descended. The property was dark and foreboding, a place that seemed to radiate a palpable sense of wrongness. Armed with flashlights, they began their search. In a shed attached to the kitchen, one of the deputies made a discovery that would forever etch the name Ed Gein into the annals of American horror. Hanging upside down from the rafters, suspended by ropes at the wrists and a crossbar at the ankles, was the body of Bernice Wardens. She had been decapitated and dressed out like a deer, her torso split open from the neck down. The horror had only just begun. The officers then entered the house itself, a place that would come to be known as Gein's House of Horrors. The stench of decay and filth was overwhelming. What they found inside defied all rational comprehension, a scene of such grotesque depravity that it seemed to have been ripped from the pages of a madman's nightmare. There were whole human bones and fragments scattered about. A wastebasket was made of human skin. The seats of chairs were upholstered in it. Skulls, some with the tops sawn off to serve as bowls, were mounted on his bedposts. There was a corset made from a female torso, skinned from shoulders to waist. Leggings made from leg skin. A lampshade made from the skin of a human face. A pair of lips dangled from a window shade drawstring. And in a shoebox, they found Mary Hogan's head in a box, and finally, Bernice Warden's head in a burlap sack, her heart in a plastic bag. While the police were uncovering this monument to madness, Ed Gein was arrested at a neighbor's house, where he was calmly eating dinner. He confessed almost immediately, not just to the murders of Hogan and Warden's, but to his years of grave robbing. In a flat, emotionless tone, he recounted his nocturnal visits to the cemeteries, his strange daze-like states, and his macabre craftwork. He led investigators to the 9 graves he had desecrated, and when 3 were exhumed, his stories were corroborated. The quiet, odd handyman of Plainfield was unmasked as a ghoul, a killer, and a craftsman of human remains. The trial of Ed Gein was a complex affair. On November 21, 1957, he was arraigned on 1 count of first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he was found mentally incompetent and unfit for trial. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. His house of horrors, which had begun to attract morbid tourists, was destroyed by a mysterious fire in March 1958, likely an act of arson by locals wanting to erase the stain on their town. For a decade, Gein remained in the mental hospital. Then, in 1968, doctors determined he was mentally able to confer with counsel and participate in his defense. A new trial began. Due to the prohibitive costs, the prosecution decided to try him for only 1 murder, that of Bernice Warden's. On November 14, 1968, in a trial without a jury, Judge Robert H. Golmar found him guilty. But the legal process was not over. A second trial was immediately held to determine his sanity at the time of the crime. After testimony from psychiatrists, Judge Golmar ruled that Gein was, indeed, not guilty by reason of insanity. He was returned to a state mental hospital, where he would spend the rest of his life. Ed Gein was, by all accounts, a model patient. He was quiet, polite, and cooperative. He died of respiratory failure from lung cancer on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. He was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, in an unmarked grave next to his brother and the mother he had so monstrously worshipped. But the story of Ed Gein did not end with his death. The horrors discovered in his farmhouse seeped into the American subconscious, providing the raw, nightmarish material for some of the most iconic works of horror in the 20th century. The quiet, mother-obsessed killer became Norman Bates in Robert Bloch's novel and Alfred Hitchcock's film, Psycho. The craftsman of human skin, the ghoul who wore the faces of the dead, became Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. The gruesome details of his life, a life of profound isolation, abuse, and a love that twisted into a monstrous obsession, have been retold and reimagined countless times, a modern American folktale of the darkest kind. The butcher of Plainfield, the shy, unassuming man from the Wisconsin farmlands, had become immortal, his legacy a chilling reminder of the darkness that can bloom in the loneliest corners of the human heart.